All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to week number 4 for PPA 500. Once we're done with tonight's class, we'll be officially halfway through our 8 weeks together, so it does go by very, very quickly. Thank you very much for your Canvas essay number 2, looking at those 3 principles from the ASPA Code of Conduct. I've gone through, read all of those, and provided some feedback and provided grades on those. Very happy with them. Again, I think they were well written. I think that they were insightful. I think there's a great deal of variety in the responses, so I didn't see the same responses over and over again, which is obviously very good. Some of the principles that I saw discussed on several occasions are the ones I expected to see discussed. The fully inform and advise, I saw that one mentioned quite often, and rightly so, because again, when we are, as administrators, being required to fully inform and advise, we're all usually fully informing and advising our overseers. And so congressional bodies or state legislatures or the executive branch. And so it's almost counterintuitive from a rational self-interested perspective that if we think an administrator is a rational self-interested actor, then we're kind of asking that person to do something that runs counter to their immediate self-interest, in that they're providing information to then make oversight of them and their organizations a little bit easier. And so they're kind of inviting a little bit more scrutiny. I think we may have mentioned it last week, but it really speaks to this phenomenon in public administration known as the principal-agent relationship, whereby the overseer is the principal and the agent is the agency, the administrative agency and the administrators. And so normally in that principal-agent relationship, you would think that the principal, the overseer, would have most of the information because they have to use that information to oversee the actions and behaviors of the agency. But under the principal-agent relationship, what we realize is that it's the agency that oftentimes has the information and the overseer does not. It's because the agency is on a daily basis implementing these policies and these programs. So it's the agency and the administrators within those agencies that really know exactly how that program is being implemented, and they're the ones who have all the information. And so therefore, it's up to them to decide what information to give to the principal, to the overseers. The more information you give, obviously, the more oversight and more scrutiny there will be of your agency. So within this principal-agent relationship, not to dig too deeply into it, but there's this thing known as a moral hazard. And in the principal-agent relationship, moral hazard speaks to the decision on the part of the agent in terms of what information to provide to the principal. And there, again, through rational self-interest, there is certainly a motivation not to provide that information, but by not providing that information to the overseer, that clearly would violate that fully inform and advise principle in the ASPA Code of Ethics. So I agree that is a difficult one oftentimes to try and implement. Another principle I saw mentioned pretty frequently was promoting ethical organizations. That is difficult because in order to promote an ethical organization, you need to have the buy-in and the agreement and the collaboration and cooperation with many individuals throughout the organization. And we know the more cooperation we need from many individuals, the more difficult it is to get anything done. So I saw why a lot of people talked about that as a difficult principle to implement. See, what else did I see? I saw the encouraging democratic participation. Several people wrote about that one as well. You know, we can encourage participation on the part of citizens, but if citizens don't want to participate, if they choose not to participate, then it's next to impossible to force them to participate. As we know, many Americans choose not to take advantage of all those different avenues for participation in our democratic system. So again, I think I saw throughout all the postings, all 8 of the principles at one point or another got mentioned in the Canvas essay number 2. So again, very happy with that. Just keep doing that type of work on future Canvas essays and we will be in good shape. Now for next week, you do not have a Canvas essay due. What you do have due is the draft advancement to candidacy form. Now, if you are not in the MPA program, then you don't have to submit a draft advancement to candidacy form. All that I ask you to do is just in the submission area, you can add a comment and just put a comment in the submission area saying, I am not enrolled in the MPA program, and then I'll award you the 5 points, because there's really no reason to put you through this exercise if you're not in the MPA program. So just put a little comment in that submission area and that will be good enough. If you are in the MPA program and you haven't submitted your draft advancement form yet, when you submit your draft advancement form, please make sure to list the semester and the year in which you plan to take all of your classes, so that I can give you some feedback, not just on the courses you're planning on taking, but on the sequencing of those courses as well. Because again, because of some monetary concerns, budgeting concerns, staffing restrictions, there are only so many sections of a class that we can offer every semester. And Dr. Butts, as our current chair, puts the schedule together. And so there are some electives that we cannot offer every single semester. There are some electives we only offer once per year. There are actually some electives that get offered less frequently than once per year because of staffing constraints. You know, we have some faculty who have retired, some adjunct faculty who have moved into other administrative positions that does not afford them the opportunity to teach anymore in the program. So just make sure to list when you're going to take the courses, and I can give you a general idea of whether or not I think the courses will be offered in that semester. Again, there are no guarantees because every semester ends up being different. But if you're in the MPA program, please do submit your draft advancement candidacy form. I've received several of them already and have responded with some feedback, just so you'll be all ready to officially advance a candidacy as soon as you are eligible after completing 6 units in the program. So that's all you have to do next week in terms of assignment, is that draft advancement to candidacy form. But since we are at the halfway point of the term, we really do need to start talking about the midterm assessment. And I've gone in and made the midterm assessment available to you. I just did that a few minutes ago. So when you log into Canvas, you should see a module there that says midterm assessment. And what I'd like to do is spend a few minutes at the outset of class tonight going through that midterm assessment, because I have found that going through the assessment in class together as a group helps answer a lot of questions that may pop up later on. And I just like to make sure we're all on the same page with what we're doing on that midterm assessment. So let me go ahead and share out the midterm assessment. And there we go. Hopefully you're able to see it now. If you can't see midterm assessment, please let me know and I'll troubleshoot it, but it should be available on your screen now. Let me move my chat box a little bit. Okay. So as I discussed in our first class session when we went through the syllabus, we have this midterm assessment that is not really an examination, it's an assessment. And by an assessment, it requires that you take information you've learned in the course and apply that information appropriately in some realistic scenarios. So for this midterm, I've constructed 5 different scenarios with 2 questions related to each scenario. The entire midterm assessment is worth 100 points. Each scenario is worth 20 points. And then within each scenario, each one of those individual questions will be worth 10 points. So 5 scenarios, 2 questions related to each scenario. The midterm assessment is due no later than 11:59 and 59 seconds p.m. on February 28th. So you've got a couple of weeks to work on this. In doing this assessment and providing your answers, you can use all the information from our class sessions. You can use information from the Cal textbook. You can use information from the classics textbook, the PowerPoint slides. All that information is available for you in answering these questions. Now, there is no right or wrong answer to any of these questions. Your answer will be evaluated based upon your justification for your answer. So your task in this midterm assessment is not to locate the best answer, but rather to locate the most appropriate answer for this given scenario. So for all the scenarios, there can be multiple ways of answering those scenarios. What I will judge your answer on is your justification for why the answer you've chosen is an appropriate answer to the scenario. Now, I'm responding to these questions associated with the scenarios. I'm a big believer in parsimony. Try and make your answers as concise as you can do. as long as they are also answering the questions. Typically, a basic rule of thumb that I've seen in the past with this midterm assessment is usually 2 or 3 sentences per question, usually going to be good enough to answer those questions. Sometimes you can get away with 1 paragraph, depends upon the nature of the question. But it really, I don't think any of these questions would take you more than 3 paragraphs to answer them adequately. So try and be as concise and parsimonious as possible. Let's go through some of these scenarios so you know what I will be asking and then kind of what I'm expecting in terms of your answers. And most of this information we've either already covered in previous classes, or we will cover the information tonight, or as is the instance with scenario number 5, that's information we will cover next week. So hopefully if time provides us with we have enough time to do this, hopefully tonight we will have covered all the information that you will need for those first 4 scenarios. Then we'll cover the theory information next week for scenario number 5. So you can start working on this midterm assessment whenever you'd like, as soon as class is over. If you want to start working on it, you can do that. But you do have the 2 weeks until February 28th to complete it and submit it. So scenario number 1. This first scenario really gets at the foundational information we covered with American government. And so the scenario reads, our work as public administrators is predicated on the protections and limitations contained within the current manifestation of our Constitution. So we've talked about our Constitution is the social contract between people and their government. Assume that you are a delegate at the Constitutional Convention and are part of Madison's faction advocating for replacing the Articles of Confederation with a new Constitution. So as we had discussed in the Constitutional Convention, the original goal was just to amend the Articles, but then the Federalists in Madison really got the ball rolling toward getting rid of the Articles and replacing them with a brand new Constitution. So you are on Madison's side at the Constitutional Convention. In 1A, present an argument for abolishing the Articles of Confederation by discussing 3 primary weaknesses with the document. Now, I did provide that link to you on our Canvas site for the Articles of Confederation. Hopefully you've had a chance to take a look through the articles. We didn't go through the articles in detail for the purposes of time in class, but we did highlight some of the primary flaws within the Articles of Confederation. So what I want you to do is discuss 3 of the primary flaws or weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation. Be sure to not only identify these weaknesses, but also present a compelling argument for why these weaknesses may be considered fatal flaws in the Articles of Confederation. So don't just list the weaknesses, but discuss why they are big enough weaknesses that you should get rid of the Articles and replace the Articles with a new Constitution. Then in 1B, present an argument designed to convince your fellow delegates, many of whom are considered anti-federalists. And remember, we had this conflict at the Constitutional Convention between Madisonian Federalists and the anti-federalists led by people like Sherman. So convince your fellow delegates, many of whom are anti-federalists, why they should trust the new Constitution that you and your fellow Federalists are proposing. In presenting your argument, include a discussion of 3 positive aspects of the new Constitution that may appeal to your anti-federalist colleagues. And to help guide your answer here in terms of your 3 positive aspects of the new Constitution, feel free to use Federalist number 39 by Madison in crafting your answer. And we spent some time in class talking about Federalist 39 and what Madison was trying to do by deconstructing the Constitution in Federalist 39. So 1A, 3 weaknesses of the Articles. 1B, presenting 3 positive aspects of this new Constitution to convince your fellow delegates to accept and ratify this new Constitution. So that's scenario number 1. That's our American government scenario. Then scenario number 2. You just started a new job with Kelman and Associates, a large advocacy firm ensconced within a historic brownstone on K Street in Washington, D.C. And if you know anything about Washington, D.C., you know that K Street is a street where all these high-profile lobbying firms are located. So if you're working for a K Street lobbyist, you're working for a very well-heeled, very well-known lobby firm. Excited by the prospect of a new job, you leave on your first day to Capitol Hill to meet with members of the Democratic caucus to discuss a proposed piece of legislation designed to designate several hundred acres of Wyoming open space as federally protected territory. You are shocked to learn that you are only one of many lobbyists scheduled to meet with legislators on this same topic today. In addition to you, there are drilling advocates from other advocacy firms, other lobbying firms, advocates representing the rights of Indigenous people, and many others vying for the attention of the members of Congress. So in 2A, reflect on your predicament. What does Madison tell us about multiple factions in Federalist 10? Do you think Madison envisioned what you are experiencing? Why or why not? So you already discussed Federalist 10 in one of your Canvas essays, but here I want you to return to Federalist 10 and use Federalist 10 to come to a conclusion about what Madison would think about the lobbying that you are witnessing in your job as a lobbyist on Capitol Hill. Then in 2B, in the course of your day, you meet with Representative Roger McGreevey, a 10-term representative from Idaho. As you begin to make your pitch for designating the land in question as federally protected open space, Representative McGreevey interrupts you. I have a keen interest in this bill because I own several acres in Wyoming adjacent to the land in question. I'm opposed to the legislation. Drilling means jobs and commerce to the area, and my land value will skyrocket if I vote against this bill and allow drilling to commence. After a long day of meetings, you head back to your K Street office, but can't stop thinking about what Representative McGreevey said. In your opinion, is what McGreevey told you an ethical violation? Should he recuse himself from discussions on the bill and any eventual vote? Why or why not? Would his behavior violate any of the standards in the ASPA Code of Conduct? So you tell me what you think about McGreevey's statement and whether it's an ethical violation and if it would violate any of those 8 principles that we have discussed in the ASPA Code of Conduct. So that gets us at our accountability and ethics information. That's what we're going to spend the first half of class tonight finishing up. Then scenario 3. The city of Preble Heights, a fictional city, is a working class neighborhood just outside of Indianapolis, Indiana. The city council has recently embarked upon a debate regarding the rehabilitation of the deteriorating recreation center on the outskirts of town. The recreation center has been closed for 6 months pending some major renovations to ensure safety of patrons. The council is split. 2 members would like to have the city spearhead the renovations. 2 members would like to turn the renovation project over to a private sector contractor who has a reputation for getting projects done quickly. The city manager presents a study that shows turning over the renovation to a private contractor would mean that the recreation center would be renovated 3 months ahead of schedule and would cost 20% less than if the project was managed by the city. The 5th council member is undecided and needs some guidance. So in 3A, discuss some of the reasons why the private contractor may be able to complete the project quicker and for less money than the city. And then 3B, discuss some of the disadvantages of turning the project completely over to a private entity. This information is your public versus private sector discussion that we will be having tonight in the second half of class. So once we're done with class tonight, you'll have all the information you need then to answer scenario number 3. And scenario number 4, as discussed in class, there is still some controversy regarding public administration as a discipline. Some feel that public administration is a discipline. Others argue that it lacks the requirements of an academic discipline and is actually a subfield of political science. This debate can be seen in the location of MPA programs across the country. Many MPA programs exist within political science departments. Some are housed in the College of Business, while others maintain status as standalone departments or colleges. And over the past decade or so, I've been doing site visits across the country to different MPA programs as they go through accreditation and reaccreditation. And I have seen this firsthand in that the plurality of departments and plurality of MPA programs tend to be housed within political science departments. So they're one program offered within a department of political science, but that's not the only model. I've seen MPA programs housed within a College of Business. When I was at Ohio State, the public administration program was within the College of Business. Subsequent to that, several years ago, it then became its own college because a major amount of funding from the Ohio legislature and former Senator and astronaut John Glenn. But when I was there, it was part of the College of Business. I've seen some arrangements where public administration programs are within a College of Education, within a College of Liberal Arts. Here at Long Beach, obviously, we are our own department, and our department only provides one program, and that is the MPA program. Now, as a department, we are housed within the College of Health and Human Services, which is a somewhat unique arrangement, but is certainly not the only arrangement like it in the country. But we are in the College of Health and Human Services, but we are a standalone department offering just the MPA program. So there are a lot of different manifestations of how the MPA degree can be offered. Discuss the field of public administration as a discipline. What elements of the study of public administration make it a discipline? What elements argue against public administration as a discipline? If time permits tonight, and I think it probably will, at the end of class tonight, we will broach this question of public administration as a discipline. We will talk about academic disciplines. We will talk about the characteristics essential for being an academic discipline. And then we'll look at public administration and talk about why or why not can we consider public administration as an academic discipline. So if time permits, you'll get that information tonight. And then whether a discipline or not, the field of public administration has always struggled with the perception and reality of a politics administration dichotomy. Originally presented by Woodrow Wilson in 1887, the politics administration dichotomy debate has been a central theme in the field of public administration for many decades. Discuss the politics administration dichotomy and its impact on how we study and engage in public administration. Now, the Wilson article you're going to be reading for next week, but we will start talking about Wilson's politics administration dichotomy tonight. And we'll do it as part of our discussion of accountability and ethics, and we'll then also do it in the second half of class in our discussion of public and private sector differences. So if time permits, you'll have that information as well by the end of class tonight. So if everything goes well, by the end of class, you'll have all the information you need for answering those first four scenarios. Now, scenario 5, you're going to have to wait until after class next week. But in scenario 5, it lays out a scenario for you with the Department of Aging. So the Department of Aging in the state of confusion is in crisis. The governor appointed Perry Lemon as the director of the department 6 months ago. Lemon is an ardent partisan with no experience in issues of aging and no discernible leadership or management skills. By an ardent partisan, we mean that he is a very loyal member of a political party, and the governor appointed him to this position because of his loyalty to the governor and his loyalty to the governor's political party. Lemon's incompetence has only added to a toxic organization culture where there is little trust between employees and outright warfare between units over scarce resources. It is not uncommon for one unit to sabotage another unit, and there is little indication that units know or care about the mission of the organization. This toxic culture has resulted in several externalities or several negative consequences. Retention is at an all-time low. The employees are leaving the organization so quickly that HR cannot replace them with new employees. The onboarding process consists of a 10-minute video explaining the organization's purpose and little else. The organization has become fixated on applying rules and regulations with little regard for serving citizens. It has gotten so bad that the state legislature has lost confidence in the department, which has led to a further reduction in the organization's appropriations. So in 5A, select 2 classical organization theories or theorists that you feel would benefit the organization. Discuss the theories and why they would benefit this organization. And then in 5B, select 2 neoclassical organization theories or theorists that you feel would benefit the organization and discuss these theories and why you believe they would benefit this organization. So 5A looks at 2 classical organization theorists or theories, and 5B looks at 2 neoclassical organization theories. Again, this is information we haven't covered yet, but we will spend the lion's share of time next week covering this information. So hopefully, if you manage your time appropriately, you'll have all your other scenarios done. And then next week, you'll just be waiting to get the information then for scenario 5. And then you'll only have scenario 5 to then finish up by the due date of February 28th. So that is the midterm assessment. Again, no right or wrong answers, just graded based upon the justification of your answer and what you believe is most appropriate in that given scenario. Be as brief and parsimonious as you can with your answers. 2 or 3 paragraphs certainly will be sufficient for each one of the questions. Luciano asks, is the document on Canvas? It is. And so I've made it, it should be available now. It's a module. And so when you go through your modules, it's listed as a module. It'll say midterm assessment, and you can just download it. And you can go ahead, download the file, and just type your answers directly into it. If you want to type your answers in red or blue or a different color, that's fine. And just put your answers directly into this midterm assessment, and then you'll upload it into the midterm assessment Dropbox. Okay. Any other questions on the midterm assessments? All right. If any questions emerge as you start working on these scenarios, feel free to reach out and send me an email, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Danny asked 2 to 3 sentences per question. Let me move this over a little bit. 2 or 3 questions per question, 2 or 3 sentences per question, or 2 to 3 paragraph. 2 to 3 paragraphs. If I said sentences, I meant 2 or 3 paragraphs per question. And again, they can be brief paragraphs. And so, for instance, a lot of times I ask you for like 3 primary weaknesses with the Articles of Confederation, or 3 primary strengths with the new Constitution. So, you might want to just give me 3 paragraphs, 1 for each one of those weaknesses or 1 for each one of those strengths. The paragraph could be 1 or 2 sentences. It can be very short, but just, it allows you kind of divide it up by 3 weaknesses and by 3 strengths, but 2 to 3 paragraphs per question usually gets it done. Okay, sure, my pleasure. Okay, I'm sorry, one more question here, Wendy. The final assessment include topics covering the midterm? Great question. No, it will not. The final assessment will only include information from the end of the midterm through the end of the class. And so on the final assessment, there'll be nothing that was covered on the midterm on the final. It is not considered a cumulative final, just from the middle of the class until the end. Sure, my pleasure. Okay, let me go ahead and stop the share. And let's jump back into our discussion of accountability and ethics. Now, last week, we didn't have a whole lot of time to devote to accountability and ethics. And so that's why I just kind of jumped ahead to give you those 8 principles in the ASPA Code of Conduct, just so you would have the information that you need in order to do that Canvas essay. Tonight, we're going to circle back and we're going to talk about all of our information in terms of accountability and ethics. Now, I told you before that our accrediting body, NASPA, requires that all accredited MPA programs must offer coverage of ethics in their core curriculum. 2 ways you can do it. One way is to have a standalone core required course in ethics. The other way is to sprinkle ethics throughout the curriculum. We've had this discussion in the past as a faculty, and there are some good things that recommend a standalone required course in ethics. The major downside, though, is that would be an additional 3 units. And so that would raise our unit requirement from 39 units up to 42 units. And that would kind of put us out of step with a lot of the MPA programs offered, at least here in California. There are some MPA programs in the country that have 45 and 48 unit requirements, and those are semester unit requirements. We want to stick with 39. So rather than having you take a new 3-unit course in the core curriculum, we decided to sprinkle ethics throughout the entire curriculum. So we cover ethics here in your first course in the program. You'll also talk about some ethical implications of allocation of resources in your budgeting course. You'll certainly talk about ethics in terms of managing human resources in your 577 course. You'll talk about ethics and accountability when you talk about organizations, organization culture and behavior in your 660 course. You'll talk about ethics when you talk about policy and the consequences of policies for different populations in your 670 course. And then obviously when you get to your research course, you can't have a research course without a discussion of ethics. So you're going to have ethics sprinkled throughout your entire core curriculum. So what do we mean when we talk about accountability and ethics? What are we talking about when we say we're holding people accountable? We're holding people accountable for what? When we talk about accountability, we are really holding people accountable for the relationship between people, administrators for our purposes, and things that they are managing. So we hold people accountable for how they manage human beings. We hold people accountable for how they manage money. We hold people accountable for how they manage their programs. We hold people accountable for how they manage their organizational operations. So it's really about this relationship between people, the administrators, and the things that they are managing. And we'll talk more about accountability and ethics when we get to the last module of this class, and we talk about managing resources. And we'll return to this idea of accountability in managing human as well as fiscal resources in a few weeks. But accountability really is a foundation of bureaucracy, because accountability allows policymakers, decision makers, elected officials to hold administrators accountable for their actions. And so it really creates the very bedrock of a bureaucracy. The problem with accountability is that accountability oftentimes has some negative connotations, because whenever we hold people accountable and whenever we scrutinize their behavior, by scrutinizing their behavior, we oftentimes uncover some very negative things. We uncover some things that are not very attractive. And so the problem there is that elected officials, your policymakers, oftentimes are very hesitant to hold administrators accountable, because once they start looking at what administrators are doing, there's the potential that they're going to find some problems. And when they find those problems will then reflect poorly upon them as elected officials. The primary goal of most elected officials is a simple one, and that's to get reelected. So if you find problems that when you do the scrutiny of administrators through accountability and you try and hold people accountable for their actions, it then reflects back on you in terms of their overseer. Why didn't you know this? Shouldn't you have known this before? And if it reflects poorly on you as an elected official, it could get in the way of your successful reelection. So elected officials oftentimes like to keep accountability at arm's length, and they really don't want to hold people accountable because that then makes them accountable as well in return. But we do need to have accountability measures because we as public administrators, we are managing public taxpayer money. We are managing public organizations that are funded with public taxpayer money. We are dealing with individuals who have constitutional rights. And if they're career civil servants, they have property rights to their employment. And so there are some really good reasons why administrators need to be held accountable for their actions. But there's really a balance that we have to strike between having these accountability measures to hold people accountable for their actions, but not having too many requirements so that people are free to be creative and take risks and make sure the job is getting done in the proper way, to make sure their job is well done. So you really want to balance accountability with still giving some flexibility and creativity to our individual administrators. Too many accountability standards and too many accountability rules and regulations may inhibit bold action on the part of our administrators and also make it difficult for us to attract the best and the brightest into the public service. And we'll talk throughout our entire discussion, the first half of this class, about how to find that balance in accountability and ethical adherence. Traditionally and historically, there have been three main approaches to accountability. The first approach you see on the screen there is what's called the legal boundaries approach. And this gets at Woodrow Wilson's politics administration dichotomy. When you read Wilson's article for next week, The Study of Administration, Wilson was making a pretty simple argument. And his argument was that the work of government, what he referred to as the quote unquote business of government, has become very complex. And he wrote that in 1887. So if he thought the work of government was complex in 1887, imagine what he would think about the work of government today. But because the work of government had become so complex, he advocated for the creation of a science or a study of administration. And this is why we oftentimes, despite all of his flaws and all of his problems as a human being that you're probably familiar with in terms of Woodrow Wilson, Woodrow Wilson is still referred to as being the grandfather of the field of public administration, because he was really the first one who wrote about creating a separate study of public administration. Now, in retrospect, over the years, obviously a lot of things have come to light about Woodrow Wilson, and there are a lot of very unsavory aspects of his view in terms of race relations, so much so that a lot of schools have been removing Wilson from their name. Princeton, as an example, he used to be president of Princeton University before he became president of the United States. So the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University used to bear his name. They've removed his name from the building, and for obvious reasons. But despite all those unsavory elements of Woodrow Wilson, he is the one who really started this idea of the need to study public administration. So in his Study of Administration article, he lays out for us this thing called the politics administration dichotomy. And if you've had undergraduate public administration before, then you're very familiar with the politics administration dichotomy. But the argument with the politics administration dichotomy is that if we can pull administration out of politics and we can separate administration from politics, then we can study administration as a science, and we can study administration to make the business of administration more efficient, as long as we can do it divorced from the political world. That's why I refer to as a politics administration dichotomy. The idea is on the political side of the equation, elected officials, policymakers make the laws. Then on the administrative side of the equation, it's administrators, hopefully objective administrators, nonpartisan administrators, who then implement those laws. So policymakers make the laws, administrators then implement and execute the laws. The argument that Wilson made is that if we're able to divorce politics and administration, then if we take politics out of administration, then we can borrow administrative innovations from other countries and apply them here to our American administrative structure. So one example he used was civil service. You're familiar with the concept of career civil service. A career civil servant is someone who gets their job based upon their merit, and they keep that job based upon their job performance. That if you're going to dismiss a career civil servant from their position, it must be well documented that they have deficient performance. You've provided them with training and development opportunities. Their performance is still deficient. You provide them with more training and development opportunities, and yet their performance is still deficient. You have to document that they are being let go, they are being released because they do not have the merit, they do not have the ability or the qualifications to do the job. You can't fire a career civil servant because they support a different political party than you do. You can't get rid of a career civil servant because you don't get along with the person personally. You have to have some real merit-based grounds for sanctioning and disciplining that employee. So Britain had this system of career civil service way back in the early and mid 1800s. What Wilson argued is that if we study administration as a science and take politics out of it, we can borrow administrative innovations from countries that have different political systems and different political cultures and apply them to our administrative structure. So in terms of the British system of career civil service, one of the things that Britain had been using for many years is they've been using competitive examinations. So people sit for these competitive exams, and then you hire the people who perform the best on those competitive exams, because performance on an exam is an indication of the merit and the qualifications of that individual. But in England, the way in which they use their competitive exams is they had a closed system of examinations, and that not everyone could sit for those exams. Well, here in our country, in the US, we realized that our political culture was a little bit different. We had a bit more of an open political culture than the class-based culture that we had seen in England. So when we borrow those examinations and put them into our civil service system in 1883 with the Pendleton Act, which we'll talk about in a future class, we had to take those closed examinations and make them open so that anyone can participate in those examinations. Another example with the British civil service system, and I'll leave it at this, is that in England, there was no lateral entry into the British civil service system. So if you were running a corporation, you were a CEO of a corporation, and you decide that you want to join the British civil service and work in government, in England, you had to go to the very bottom of the civil service and then work your way back up. Here in the US, that wouldn't work. We needed to have lateral entry into the career civil service. And so we opened it up to make lateral entry so that people who are in upper management positions in the private sector could enter laterally into the US career civil service. But the idea is by focusing on administration, you can borrow all these innovations from other countries and apply them to your administrative structure. But this politics administration dichotomy, this separation between politics and administration, very quickly we learned that it wasn't a complete distinction. That politics and administration bleed over together and they cross over and they overlap in our system of government. That when administrators implement and execute laws and execute policies, they're not only just executing policies, but they're also involved in the formulation of those policies as well. So administrators are doing political work as well as administrative work. Under the legal boundaries approach, if an administrator was engaging in political work, if an administrator was engaging in policy formulation, that was an ethical violation because they had crossed the line from administration into politics. But very quickly in the 1930s, we learned that they had to cross the line. They had to go into politics. It wasn't necessarily unethical for them to engage in policy formulation. It was something that was part and parcel of their job as administrators. And so you move into this second approach to accountability known as the political challenges approach. And the political challenges approach, we recognize that because of the ambiguous nature of laws that are being passed by Congress, administrators had to get involved in making sense of those laws. So it wasn't as simple as Congress passes this law that's very clear in how to implement, hands it to the administration, and administrators go ahead and implement that law. It wasn't that easy as we would think it would be under the politics administration dichotomy. In order to get anything passed through Congress, you got 435 members of the House and 100 members of the Senate. If you're going to get a majority of members of the House and the Senate to agree to anything, you're going to have to take out a lot of the specifics. The more specifics you put in a piece of legislation, the less likely it is you'll get a majority of people to agree to it, because there are more things in there for people to disagree with. So Congress tends to pass these very vague and ambiguous laws, and then we'll leave it up to the administrators to fill in all the blanks, to write the rules through the rulemaking process to govern how this piece of legislation should be implemented and how it should be executed. Whenever you have administrators who are writing the rules and filling in the blanks of legislation, they are engaging in budget formulation, policy formulation, which is very much a political type of activity. So under the political challenges model, we recognize that there is a blurring of the lines between politics and administration. And it's not just as easy as saying, well, you do this and you do that. Policymakers do politics and administrators do administration, that there is a blurring of those lines. The more contemporary approach to accountability, the evolving policy problems approach, is a very contextual approach, which says that we can no longer have the same ethical requirements across the board for every organization in every single position. We have recognized that every organization today has its own unique culture. Every profession has its own set of norms and conduct and expectation. So there's no longer a single professional norm or a single requirement that can be applied to every single agency in every single situation. It's a contextual situation-based type of an approach, whereby we have to take into account the unique culture within an organization in order to try and enhance ethical adherence and accountability. So my favorite answer to every question is obviously, I've told you before, it depends. Well, this is your it depends answer. It depends upon the organization, the policy you're talking about, and the positions involved in the implementation of that policy. This means that in the modern day approach to accountability, we have a very messy and a very complex approach in terms of trying to achieve ethical adherence. It's not as simple and straightforward as politics versus administration. It's a much messier, much more convoluted way in which we need to try and enforce ethics and accountability. But when we try and enforce ethics and accountability in the public sector, the question then becomes, what are we holding people accountable for? Well, one element of accountability is fiscal accountability, and this is the one that's most commonly used. This is what we oftentimes think about when we think about holding administrators accountable. In fiscal accountability, we are concerned with if the agency officials are spending the money on the programs that they are supposed to spend that money on. To put it another way, are they spending the money in the legally appropriated manner? So we have a lot of limitations in government on how we can spend money. So when you take the budgeting class, you'll be exposed to fund-based accounting. And so local governments will use a variety of different types of funds. Their largest fund is what's known as a general fund. In the general fund, most of the general fund will probably be unrestricted revenue, which can be spent in a variety of different ways. But there can also be restricted sources of revenue as well, where that revenue is earmarked and can only be spent on certain types of things. So you think about something like a motor fuels excise tax, the gas tax. The gas tax, those proceeds need to be captured, and they then need to be spent on highway and road construction and reconstruction. They're earmarked for that purpose. So if you take that money and you spend it on another purpose, that runs counter to state law, and that's going to be an unethical practice. So we want to make sure with fiscal accountability that the money is being spent in the way in which it is supposed to be spent, in its legally appropriated manner. A second element of accountability is what we call process accountability. In process accountability, we are concerned with how agencies are doing their job, how they are implementing these policies and these programs. So in process accountability, we look squarely at implementation. So we look at the process of implementation, and we make sure that agencies are following all the requirements spelled out in law in how these policies are supposed to be implemented. Then your third element of accountability is program accountability. In program accountability, we are concerned with the outcomes, with the consequences of our policies and our programs. So are our policies and programs achieving their stated goals and objectives? Are they having the desired outcome, the desired consequence on those citizens who are deriving benefits from these policies and these programs? So fiscal accountability, we look at how we're spending the money. Process accountability, we look at how we are implementing the policies and the programs. Program accountability, we are looking at if these programs and policies are actually achieving their stated and desired goals and objectives. So as you can see, there are a lot of different things we can hold people accountable for. It's not just money, it goes beyond that and looks at policy implementation as well as policy outcomes and policy consequences. So if we want to hold people accountable fiscally or in terms of a process orientation or a program accountability orientation, how do we do it? The way we do it is by finding that balance between having these external rules and regulations, these codes of conduct, these laws that will dictate behavior, and balancing that then with the character and training of administrators within our agencies. So we need to balance an external controls approach with an internal controls approach. And one of the best ways to do that is through the protection of who we refer to as whistleblowers. Who knows best what is going on in an organization than people who are housed within that organization, people who are working in that organization on a daily basis, people who are implementing these policies and these programs every single day. So that's where we're going to get our information from. The Congress lacks that information. Go back to that principal-agent relationship we talked about at the very beginning of class tonight. The principal doesn't have the information, the agent has the information. So what we need to do is we need to protect people who, when they see ethical violations and they then speak up about those ethical violations, they know that they will be protected from reprisals and repercussions. Those people who speak out about those ethical violations going on within their organizations, obviously those who we refer to as whistleblowers. Those whistleblowers who remain in the organization and point out ethical violations while remaining in the organization, they're referred to as the voice of the organization. These are people who decide to remain within the organization and try and fix the organization from inside out. The other option is that they can exit the organization, they can leave and go to another organization, and then point out the ethical violations in the organization that they just left. But for most people, they want to be the voice. They want to stay in their organization and they want to, again, correct those problems from the inside out of their organization. So those are the whistleblowers that need to be protected. And that's essential in accountability and ethics, to make sure those whistleblowers are protected from reprisals and repercussions for blowing the whistle on ethical violations. The Whistleblowers Act is a perfect example of that. In 1989, we had this Whistleblowers Act that provides those protection to whistleblowers. So you cannot fire a whistleblower because they blew the whistle on an ethical violation. You cannot demote them. You cannot take advancement opportunities away from them. They have those types of protections, and we need to have whistleblowers in order to make sure that we know what's going on in the agencies and can hold agencies and administrators accountable for their actions. So one of the big distinctions between working in the public sector and working in the private sector is in the public sector, you are dealing with public taxpayer money. You are dealing with public organizations that are funded with public taxpayer money. So the ethical expectations are oftentimes higher in the public sector than they are sometimes in the private sector. And sometimes when people move from the private sector to the public sector, they have this shock of ethical upgrade. And I've talked just last semester, I was talking to a student who moved from the private sector into the public sector, and he was absolutely shocked with all the rules and regulations he had to follow. I'll give you an example. You think about contracting out. And so if you want to construct a building, you're going to contract out. You're going to have to sign a contract with a private sector corporation if you're a government agency. Well, that's probably going to require that you engage in what's called competitive bidding. So when you engage in competitive bidding, you have to put out a request for proposals, an RFP. Then you'll have all these contractors that will apply, respond to your RFP with sealed bids. You collect all those sealed bids. Then at a predetermined time and place, you open up all those sealed bids. All those contractors can be there and watch you open the sealed bids. And then you award the bid to the lowest bid that is responsible and responsive. That's competitive bidding. So we have to have these sealed bids. We have to do it on an anonymous basis. So there's no nepotism, there's no favoritism in how we hand out these contracts, because again, it's public money. In the private sector, you usually don't have to do competitive bidding. If you have an existing relationship with a contractor, a private corporation can contract with that contractor without having to worry about going through a competitive bidding process. So that's just one example of some of the main differences between the ethical requirements in the public sector versus the private sector. Sometimes having too many regulations and too many requirements in government code can make it difficult for you to attract the best and the brightest into public service. So we have to strike that balance between hiring the most skilled administrators and then ensuring that public interest is preserved through ethical adherence. But oftentimes those ethical standards are much more rigorous in the public sector. So in order to get people to work in the public sector, even though their salaries are probably going to be lower than what they could get in the private sector, and they're going to have to jump through more hoops and adhere to more rules and regulations, there has to be another reason for them to work in the public sector. And so we've strived year after year to try and make work in the public sector more appealing. Because typically the bureaucracy is held in very low regard by the public. And there is a very famous book by Charles Goodsell that was written decades ago called The Case for the Bureaucracy. And in his book, Goodsell makes the argument that the problem is people tend to have a negative view of the bureaucracy because of their last experience. So they may have had 100 experiences with a government agency. 99 of those may have been good, but that last experience was negative. And so that then colors their view of the bureaucracy, and they then end up with a very negative view of the bureaucracy because of that low negative experience. So when people think about bureaucracy, they tend to think about something that's inefficient. They think about a lot of red tape. They think about a very impersonal type of relationship with citizens. Usually they're all very negative types of words that are used to describe the bureaucracy. Goodsell argued that it's incumbent upon administrators to show the public how important bureaucracy is and to show them how government touches almost every single aspect of their lives. George H.W. Bush referred to government service as the highest and noblest calling. Barack Obama, when he ran for president in 2008, said that his primary goal was to make government and public service cool again. That if we can really turn around this negative view of the bureaucracy, it'll make it much more likely that people will view working in the public sector as being a fulfilling vocation that gives them the opportunity to impact the lives of many people and to really make a difference in their communities. And if they have that type of external efficacy feeling about working in the bureaucracy, then they're willing to tolerate a lot of these different rules and regulations they have to follow for the purposes of ethical adherence. So we have in government code a lot of requirements for how we have to go about our daily business as administrators. And it's beyond the scope of this class to really get into a lot of the details on that, but there are a lot of rules and regulations we have to follow in government code. Then we also have expectations that come to us in the form of professional norms. And so if you're an engineer, you have your own professional engineering society that has its own standards and its own code of conduct. If you're a budget analyst, then you have your own code of conduct from a budget analyst type of perspective. If you're a psychologist, you've got your APA type of code of conduct. The one code of conduct, like we said last week, that we all share as public administrators is the ASPA Code of Conduct, the American Society for Public Administration, and those 8 different principles that we need to be held accountable for as public administrators. And you talked about those in your Canvas essay last week. One of the major ways that we can hold people accountable and ensure ethical adherence is through the use of transparency, to make the work of government as transparent and as open to the public as possible. That if decisions are made in open sessions, if decisions are made when we do what we call let the sun shine in on our decisions in the public sector, then it's easier to scrutinize those decisions and it's easier to gain the trust of the public if they can see how decisions are being made. Here in the state of California, we have some of the strictest transparency and openness requirements of any state in the country. And you're probably familiar with some of these aspects of transparency in California. One piece of legislation that requires transparency is this thing called the Brown Act. The Brown Act requires that public meetings of public bodies such as city councils or boards of supervisors or water districts or school districts, that those types of public meetings must be conducted in public. So the vast majority of decisions that those governing bodies make need to be made in a public setting, where the public can attend and the public can see the discussion and participate in that discussion. Now, it's true that the Brown Act does allow for what's called a closed or executive session. And so there are certain decisions and topics that can be decided within the closed session, but they're very, very narrow scope of topics. Personnel issues can be dealt with in closed session for privacy reasons. And so if you have to terminate an employee, that decision can be handled in closed session, but it then must be reported out in open session. We don't use the person's name, we use an employee number so that you can protect their privacy. Discussions with legal counsel can be done in closed session. I was on a school board for several years, and safety discussions in terms of the specific modifications that we would make to a school facility to ensure safety, those can be done in closed session, because obviously you don't want to give out a lot of those particulars in open session, and then people could take advantage of that information as a threat to a school facility. So there are certain things that you can do in closed session, but the vast majority must be done in open session. And within that open session, you also have to have public comment. And so you have to allow the public to have an opportunity to address the board or the council or whatever governing body it is, and have a certain period of time whereby they can address the board on agenda as well as non-agenda items. Another aspect of transparency here in California that's meant for promoting ethical adherence is the idea of a public records request. Now, at the federal level, you're probably familiar with the FOIA, a federal information request, and the FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request. Here in California, we have PRRs, public records requests. And with a public records request, any member of the public can request public documents, public communication on any issue that they are interested in. And so if you've got a city council that is discussing building a new facility, building a new city hall, and if you're very concerned about the money they're spending to build a city hall, and you think that they've been doing things behind closed doors, you can put forth a public records request. And you can request all communication between anyone in the city dealing with this issue of the construction of the city hall. The city would then have 10 days to respond to that public records request, and everything is discoverable where there was a discussion concerning that issue of city business. And so emails where members of city council were discussing this construction of the city hall, those emails are all discoverable and must be turned over. Text messages, if you have text messages on a private phone, those text messages, that private phone then becomes discoverable too through a public records request. So I oftentimes say in California, local officials will oftentimes maintain a separate phone just for government business, separate from their personal phone for that very reason. Now, the Brown Act requires that if you have a majority of members of a governing body that are meeting, that then has to be an agendized open meeting. The agenda must be provided at least 72 hours in advance to the public, and it must be done in open session. If you have, say, 5 members of your city council, and 3 of them are discussing an issue within the jurisdiction of the city via email outside of an open session, that would be a violation of the Brown Act. And that could be discoverable then through a public records request. Certain positions are also reportable positions, which means that you need to complete a conflict of interest form. A lot of administrative positions in the Cal State system are considered to be Form 700 positions, which means they have to fill out and submit a conflict of interest form. On that conflict of interest form, you would need to list your sources of income, any sources of income that you're earning from within that jurisdiction, any property holdings you have beyond just your primary residence within that jurisdiction, to make sure that you don't have any type of vested interest that could sway your decision making. Again, the whole purpose here is to go back to the ASPA Code of Conduct, that you are putting public interest above private interest. And when we talk about public employment, we'll talk about the development of the career civil service in a couple of weeks. And I'll read you an excerpt from a book by a man named George Washington Plunkett. And he was a member of the Tammany Hall political machine in New York City in the turn of the century, in the early 1900s. And in his book, he has a lot of interesting reflections about what he considers to be within the public interest, even though it benefits him privately. It's a really interesting discussion of what he refers to as honest versus dishonest corruption. And we'll get to that in a couple of weeks. But this is a whole idea of making sure that you are maintaining the public interest rather than using your public position to further your own private financial interest. So a lot of the ways in which we keep people ethical, if you will, and we keep them in adherence with ethical principles, comes through transparency and openness. And again, the state of California is one state that really does value transparency much more so than a lot of other states across the country. But I know we're kind of running along here with accountability and ethics, and we have other work we have to do tonight. So let's just kind of wrap this up with a conclusion. I think the major theme of what we discussed over the past hour has been this need to maintain a balance. We need to strike a balance between external controls, those external controls in terms of keeping people in adherence with ethical principles, and allowing them flexibility to still be bold and be creative in their decision making. So we really have to have the balance. We can hold people accountable while at the same time freeing them up to do the job in the best way that they can possibly do the job. We need them to feel free to take risks and make good decisions. And we also need to still be able to attract the best and the brightest into the public sector. Too many rules and regulations will make it difficult to attract the best and the brightest. So it's important that we have this balance between ethical adherence and effectiveness of government agencies and effectiveness of administrator actions. If we don't have that balance, we don't maintain that proper balance, it will be impossible for the public sector and for public organizations to meet the demands of the public. So you can't be too far on one side or too far on the other. Ethical adherence really is a function of both ethical standards, external controls, as well as the training and characteristics of individual administrators who are trying to pursue public interests and trying to do the public good. You have to combine those two things together and balance them in order to truly hold people accountable for their actions. But again, this is just a really brief introduction to accountability and ethics. You'll get more accountability and ethics as you go through your core courses in your required program. And depending on the elective courses you take, you'll also get a sprinkling of ethics in some of those elective courses. On occasion in the past, when I was chair, I was able to recruit a couple faculty members to put together an elective course in public sector ethics. And we were able to offer that for a few years. I don't know if Dr. Butts has any plans to bring that back, but we did have the opportunity to offer that about once a year as an elective course. I'm hoping that course does come back in the near future. And if you're very interested in this idea of accountability and ethics in the public sector, hopefully that will be an elective course that may be back on the books within the next year or two. I'll stop there because I know we are already after 5 o'clock and we have a whole lot more work to do tonight. So are there any initial observations or comments or questions on this brief discussion of accountability and ethics in the public sector? Okay. Yes, Luciano, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all this knowledge. I guess it's just a comment that it's easier said than done when you're in meetings and you want to be accountable, you want to have these minutes ready and all that, but sometimes some people are not aware of how these things function. So that brings the question about, is public administration like needed? And I believe it is, and hence I'm here at the program because the idea is to become better at serving the public, right? But sometimes, you know, you're in meetings or certain groups are formed or factions within the colleges that I work at. It's kind of difficult because it's like, how do you address this when the majority, you know, might be a little sloppy, excuse the language. So it's interesting how, you know, all these conversations are important. So I guess I'll be interested in taking that one class because these discussions, I think, could help further prepare yourself to not be like the norm, you know what I mean? And so sometimes it's difficult. It depends, you know, the programs or who you're serving, the college. But yeah, it's interesting because I've seen a lot of stuff. Like I work at like 4 different community colleges, and it's interesting how you see different kind of groups forming, and some adhere more to this versus others within departments and so forth. So yeah, it's pretty good conversation actually to really have. So thank you for all this knowledge that you're sharing, sir.
Yeah, and you make a really great point is that, you know, to ensure ethical organizations, you really need the work of everyone. And it's very frustrating. And, you know, working in a department of public policy administration, you know, within the college, it can be frustrating for me sometimes when I see administrators who don't follow the proper policy. And the policy is there for a reason, and they don't follow the proper policy. But coming from a public policy background, that's kind of the bane of your existence when people don't follow the policies that they are supposed to follow. And so it is difficult when you have different folks who really, don't follow the policies and don't really think it's that important to adhere to ethical principles. And I think you make a good point that not everyone is equally aware of these ethical principles and equally aware of the rules and the regulations. I mean, when I was on the board, I can't tell you how many times I was yelled at by members of the audience when they said, well, I don't have enough time to speak, because the Brown Act allows agencies to who offer a reasonable amount of time for public comment. And so if you have 50 members of the public who want to speak on the same topic and you give them 2 minutes to speak, well, they're going to want 5 minutes to speak, or they're going to want 10 minutes to speak. And so it does get to be a little dicey sometimes when you try and enforce some of these elements of the Brown Act when people don't really understand what the Brown Act says. And so I think it's important for everyone, if you're in any one of those types of positions, to get a copy of the Brown Act. And there are a lot of good, a lot of law firms that have put together a nice synopsis of the Brown Act, and just be aware of what the Brown Act says, because a lot of people just really don't even know what's in the Brown Act. So I think that's a good point. A lot of people just don't understand and know what some of these regulations and rules are. Okay, great comment, great observation. Anything else before we take a brief break tonight? Okay. Let's go ahead and take a break. Let's take a break until, we'll call it 5:25. And we come back at 5:25. We're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to move into a discussion of what is public administration and how public administration is similar and different than private administration, and kind of tease out why we're in an MPA program as opposed to being in an MBA program. So take a break, come back at 5:25, and we'll get into discussion of some of the major differences and similarities between public and private administration. Okay, it's 5:25, so welcome back, everyone. What I'd like to turn our attention to now is talking about the field of public administration and drawing distinctions between public administration and private sector administration. Now, we know public administration is everywhere. I mean, it's an immense size and scope of public administration. As we talked about before, government bureaucracy really touches just about every part of our everyday lives, from the safety of the cars we drive, to the safety of the food we eat, to the safety of the prescription medication that we take, the regulations that go into the pillow you put your head on at night. All of these things are regulated by government and are touched by government bureaucracy in one way or another. Because bureaucracy is so ubiquitous, and because it touches so many aspects of our life, it's not surprising that bureaucracy is always a major source of a lot of debate. And the debate about bureaucracy is oftentimes a debate about how to make bureaucracy more efficient and more effective, how to make bureaucracy more personal, how to make bureaucracy better meet the wants, needs, and desires of the citizens that come into contact with the bureaucracy. Our goal, obviously, in public administration is to have efficient program implementation while still having accountability measures to hold administrators accountable to elected officials as well as the public. So what is public administration? Public administration is the study of public bureaucracy. Well, that helps us a little bit, but not completely, because then what is public bureaucracy? Public administration is a study of public bureaucracy. Public bureaucracy refers to public organizations. Now, that's a little bit better, but what's a public organization? A public organization is a formal, rational system of relationships among people vested with administrative authority to carry out public programs. Now, it's a long definition, but there are some really important parts to that definition. It's formal and rational. And so it is a formal organization with a formal structure, and it is structured in a formal way to be as rational as possible. And when we talk about rational, we mean we're rational when we make decisions based upon empirical evidence, based upon information. We don't make decisions just because it's how we feel. We make decisions because this is the information that we have. We collect the information, we analyze it, and we use that analysis to make decisions. So we're formal, we are also rational, and there are relationships among people within these organizations who are vested with administrative authority to carry out public programs. That administrative authority is a very important part of the definition, because one of the things that will differentiate between public and private organizations is legal legitimacy. So public organizations are created through enabling legislation. They are created through enabling legislation, which gives them a legal basis and a legal standing that private corporations oftentimes lack. So when we're talking about a public organization, we're talking about a formal and rational system of relationships among people who have this administrative authority bestowed upon them from legislation. So there's that legal basis for what they are doing and why they are doing what they do in these bureaucratic organizations. But again, these bureaucratic organizations that make up public administration oftentimes get a very bad rap, in that we look at the bureaucracy oftentimes as being too efficient to accomplish much of anything, but at the same time being made up of all too efficient users and abusers of power. And so people look at organizations as being inefficient in terms of meeting the needs of people, but that the people who work within the bureaucracy are very good at using their authority and using their power and sometimes abusing their power. Again, very negative connotations that tend to be attached to the term bureaucracy. In public administration, that's what we are studying, is we are studying these public bureaucracies. We oftentimes are saying these public organizations that are vested with administrative authority by some type of governing body, typically by a legislative body. Public administration as a field for many years has suffered from what we call a crisis of identity, in that public administration always tries to separate itself from private administration and tries to show why it is different than private administration. I had mentioned before in our first class session that when you told family and friends you were getting an MPA, they may have heard MBA, because the MBA degree is much more prevalent. There are a lot more MBA programs across the country than MPA programs. But there is a difference, obviously, between public and private administration. And we'll talk about a lot of those discrete differences in a second when we talk about the Graham Allison article. But two of the major differences between public and private administration, number one is this role of public authority for public organizations. So again, they have this legal legitimacy. They are created through this enabling legislation that's passed by a governing body. So they have legal legitimacy that oftentimes private companies will lack. And there are also characteristic processes that go on in public administration that are somewhat different than the processes that go on in the private sector. And we'll really tease out some of those different organizational processes in just a couple of minutes. Another important distinction between public administration and private administration is that public organizations contribute to both policy execution and formation. What that means is that we talked about before, when we talked about the politics administration dichotomy and how we've moved away from that politics administration dichotomy, because we have recognized that administrators get involved in both the creation of policy, the formation of policy, as well as the implementation of that policy. Private sector organizations tend to be much less involved in policy formation, but are still involved in implementation. Think about things like regulations. And so government regulations, those are enforced by government organizations, but are enforced upon private sector corporations. So private sector corporations contribute to and participate in the implementation of those government regulations. The creation of those government regulations, granted, private corporations can form lobby organizations and can lobby members of Congress, but they're not nearly as directly involved in the creation of those regulations and those policies as their public sector counterparts. So that's another big difference, is that the public sector is involved in both formation as well as execution, whereas the private sector is primarily only involved in execution. And here, I think, is a really nice way to demonstrate these differences between public and private sector organizations. And that's this thing called the Federal Anti-Deficiency Act. The Federal Anti-Deficiency Act prohibits government officials from spending on anything unless it's explicitly authorized by law. You can only spend money on things that you are specifically authorized to spend money on by law. However, private organizations can spend money on anything as long as it's not forbidden by law. So the public sector, we have to have it authorized by law. In the private sector, they can spend on anything as long as it's not forbidden by the law. So you can see how much more restrictive what we can do in the public sector is as compared to what the private sector can do. This Federal Anti-Deficiency Act actually made the news in the last administration, the Trump administration. We had a government shutdown. And that government shutdown then led to the shutdown of parts of the Department of Treasury. Well, one part of the Department of Treasury that had a partial shutdown was the Internal Revenue Service. And this happened right in the middle of tax season. So people were frustrated because IRS agents were told to stay home. Those who were answering the phone, the customer service agents, were told to stay home. And so people really couldn't get answers to their tax questions from the IRS during this government shutdown. And they had a lot of questions because the Trump administration had just signed into law the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, this big piece of legislation that was then going into effect for the first time in that tax year. So the Trump administration decided that through this government shutdown, they still wanted IRS agents to go to work, and they still wanted to be able to pay IRS agents. Well, the problem with that is the money was not authorized to be used for paying IRS agents because we had not had an appropriations bill passed yet for the Department of Treasury. So there was no legal authorization to spend money on these IRS agents. So the Trump administration was accused of violating this Anti-Deficiency Act by trying to pay the salaries of IRS agents to keep the IRS going. What ended up happening is the government shutdown ended. They came to an agreement on the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, and the question then became moot. But at least for a while there, the Anti-Deficiency Act was very prominent in the news in terms of the Trump administration trying to pay people with money that they did not have authorization to spend. But I think it's a really good distinction between public and private sectors. Again, we can only do what's authorized in the law. Private sector can do whatever it wants as long as it's not forbidden by the law. But let's delve down a little bit deeper into some of the specific similarities and differences between public and private organizations. And one of the articles you had assigned for tonight was the Graham Allison article. It's one of those staple articles in any public administration program. And Graham Allison has a title to his article that's an interesting title: Public and Private Management, Are They Fundamentally Alike in All Unimportant Respects? So are they fundamentally alike in all unimportant respects? In other words, he's saying, are they similar in all the ways that don't really matter, but they differ in the big ways that really do matter? So if you had the chance to read the Allison article, what are some of the similarities between the public and private sector? What are some of the things that private organizations do that are also done in public organizations? Any similarities between the two?
They both have like business plans to follow, or they have to create a business plan. They also have to have like a mission, or what they're, who they want to serve or what they want to do.
Right. Yeah, exactly. You know, whether you're in a public sector organization or a private sector organization, you're going to engage in strategic planning. You're going to have to create a mission statement. You're going to have to articulate goals and objectives related to that mission statement. So public and private sector managers both engage in this planning function. It's kind of a generic management function that occurs in both the public as well as the private sectors. And that's, one of the first main similarities A points out between the two sectors. What else do public and private sector managers tend to do that is similar? They plan the operations of their organization. Anything else that they do that's similar? If you have an organization, you have to have what in your organization?
Secure the finance, the money to have it, or have employees.
Exactly. Yeah, you have to have employees and you have to have resources to pay those employees. So you have to engage in budgeting, and public and private sector managers both engage in budgeting, securing the resources to then make the actions and the operations of the agencies and organizations possible. And they have to have employees. And so they both engage in the staffing function, where they recruit employees, they bring them into the organization, they allocate work among those employees, they evaluate the performance of those employees, they provide those training and development opportunities. And so the HR, the staffing function, is something done by both the public as well as private organizations. And these things like planning, staffing, and budgeting are what Allison refers to as generic management functions. And generic management functions are functions done by both sectors. And in fact, he adds a few more to it in what's known as POSCORP. And next week, when we get into our discussion of organization theories, we'll talk more about POSCORP. And POSCORP, I'll put that in text here, POSCORP stands for planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. So the P's for planning, as we had discussed before, that both organizations have to engage in planning. Organizing, whether we're in the public or private sector, we have to organize the operations of our organization. We have to have a structure to our organization, different positions and reporting mechanisms in our organizations. That's common across both sectors. As we discussed before, staffing, you have to get people into your organization and allocate work among them in both sectors. Directing, you have to direct the operations of your organization. You have to direct the organization so that the organization can achieve its mission and the goals that it's articulated in the planning process. You have to have a lot of coordination. You have to coordinate all the different activities going on in your organization to, again, make sure everyone is working together to achieve your common goals and your common mission. You have to have a reporting mechanism. We have to report how well we are functioning and how well we are achieving our goals and our objectives. At the federal level, every fiscal year, federal agencies and departments have to complete these things called performance activity reports. And those performance activity reports, they have to report on how much progress they've made toward the achievement of their goals. And then future appropriations are then tied to how good of a job they are doing in achieving their articulated goals. And then the B finally is what we had talked about before, budgeting. You have to secure the financing and the money for your organizations. So planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. These are generic management functions that are done between the public and the private sector. So the basic, what Allison is telling us is that the what is the same. So what public and private organizations do is the same. The functions are similar. The difference is in how those functions are done. So the difference is how planning is done is different in the public compared to the private sector. How staffing is done is different between the sectors. The money we rely upon, excuse me, is different between the public and the private sectors. In the public sector, we are oftentimes reliant upon appropriations. And those appropriations tend to be a lot more stable than the profits that are being generated by private sector organizations. So what we do is similar. It's how we do it that is really the major distinction between public and private sector organizations. So are they alike in unimportant respects? Well, they're alike in these very generic types of management functions. But where they differ is how they carry out these functions. So let's just drill down quickly about some of the specific differences in how they carry out these processes and these functions. So in the staffing function, the primary difference is in the public sector, we have career civil servants. These career civil servants get their jobs based upon their qualifications. They get their jobs based upon their merit, their ability to do the job. Sometimes that merit is demonstrated through a series of examinations. Sometimes it's demonstrated through what we call knowledge, skills, and abilities through a review of a resume, but they have to demonstrate that they have the qualifications for the job. So you get your job based upon your merit, and then you keep your job based upon how well you are doing that job. So in a career civil servant, they have protections against arbitrary dismissal. They cannot be dismissed for political reasons. They cannot be dismissed for personal reasons. They can only be sanctioned and disciplined for merit-based types of reasons and how well they are doing their job. Career civil servants have these types of protections. In the private sector, most employees are what we call at-will employees. So they work at the will of the organization, which means if the organization wants to get rid of them, there's very little documentation. They can get rid of them for whatever reason they want to, as long as that reason is not prohibited by law. So you can't get rid of somebody based upon racial discrimination or gender discrimination. That's against the law. But for any other reasons, you can get rid of that person because they're an at-will employee. That is a significant difference, because when you are dealing with a career civil servant, that limits what you can do in terms of managing those employees as a manager, in that they have their career civil service protections. They will probably have a position description. They will work within that position description, and they're oftentimes going to be unionized as well. So if you ask them to do something outside of their position description, that's something that they can grieve to their union, because as a public manager, you not only have to be aware of their career civil service protections, but you also have to be aware of their protections that are afforded to them in their collective bargaining agreement, in that contract that emerges from the result of the negotiation process between administration and the bargaining unit for the employees. So you're much more limited in managing your personnel with career civil servants than you would be managing at-will employees. So how you do the staffing is different. The measures of performance that we use in the public versus the private sector are much different as well. In the public sector, our performance measures are oftentimes much more qualitative. They're what we call softer performance measures. So if you're trying to enhance the quality of life of a citizen, that quality of life measure, we can certainly come up with some empirical indicators of quality of life, but it's a much more qualitative, much more subjective type of outcome as compared to creating widgets in a private corporation. You can measure performance in creating widgets very easily in a private corporation. How much money did you spend to make this X amount of widgets? That's a very quantitative, very empirical type of measure of performance. So the measures of performance are different between public and private sectors. We have more competing standards in the public sector as compared to private organizations. Go back to our first real discussion about American government and the implications of American government for public administration. And we said the separation of powers and federalism give us the system of many masters. And so if you're in a local agency, you are held accountable to other local agencies, to state agencies, to federal agencies, to executive, to legislative, to judicial. You've got a lot of masters with many competing standards that you are held accountable for. It's a much more direct and much cleaner way in the private sector of identifying standards and holding people accountable for the achievement of those standards. We've got, obviously, we work in the fishbowl here in the public sector, so we have a lot more public scrutiny. We have scrutiny from the media. We have scrutiny from citizen and consumer advocacy groups. We have scrutiny from interest groups. We have scrutiny from overseers in terms of legislative bodies, from the executive branch. We have a lot more scrutiny that we're subject to in the public sector than what we would see in the private sector. As we had talked about in the first half of class, there are a lot more transparency and openness requirements if you're in the public sector as compared to the private sector. Persuasion. Because we are dealing with career civil servants who have both civil service protections as well as collective bargaining agreement protections, we oftentimes don't have the same ability to direct people and order them to do certain things and expect them to do it. Instead, we need to persuade them. We need to use, as Richard Neustadt called it, the powers of persuasion. And you have to be persuasive because you don't have the same ability to direct people to take certain types of actions. And obviously, there's a whole lot more oversight, as we mentioned before, in the public sector as compared to the private sector. Again, this many masters type of argument. So I think Allison makes a really compelling argument to us that, again, what we do may be similar in terms of generic management functions. It's how we carry out those functions that is really different between public and private sector organizations. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at the Allison article, I'd really highly recommend that you do it. There's a lot more to the Allison article, but we're just kind of bottom lining it. That's kind of the major takeaway from Graham Allison's article. And whenever we talk about differences between public and private sectors, this is kind of the classical article that you always go back to. That really does a nice job of creating this typology of public versus private sector organizations. But the one difference we haven't really talked much about yet is the profit motive. And usually when you ask people what's the difference between a public organization and a private organization, is they will correctly say that private organizations they operate to make a profit. That if you're a private organization and you are not running a profit, you're probably not going to be a private organization for long. You're going to be going out of business very quickly. Public sector organizations typically do not operate to make a profit. Now, there can be some exceptions to that. There's a type of public organization known as a government corporation. Government corporations are allowed to run a profit. They are allowed to make a profit. Now, not all of them do. The U.S. Postal Service is a good example of that, in that they're allowed to make a profit. They tend not to make a profit, but government corporations can run a profit. Also, on the flip side of the coin, there are some non-governmental organizations that tend to be nonprofits. So private non-governmental organizations like private nonprofits, they are a private organization. They're not governmental, but they are nonprofit as well. And so I think this profit motive, this lack of a bottom line in the public sector, I think that this is what we would call a necessary but not sufficient distinction between the two sectors. I think it's an important distinction, but that alone is not a good enough distinction between the two sectors. I think we have to go back to our previous slide and really talk about the how carrying out management functions differs between the two sectors. I think that's probably the most efficient and most effective way of distinguishing between public and private organizations. Now, earlier on, we also distinguished between the public and private organization in terms of the role they play in policy formation and policy execution. So public and private organizations, as we mentioned before, both engage in policy execution. They both have a role to play in the implementation of policies. But when it comes to policy formation, that's much more the domain of public organizations, and they're going to contribute much more directly to the formal policy-making process. So when we see an organization involved in policy formulation, typically it's going to be a public organization, whereas either public or private organizations can be involved in execution. And policy execution is just simply the task of translating written laws into action. So laws are created by either an elective legislative body or by a chief executive through an executive order, and then administrators shape these ideas into reality, and administrators implement these policies in policy execution. But how are public organizations and public administrators involved in policy formation? Well, they're involved in a couple of different ways. Before a policy is made, oftentimes these public administrators will advise officials, they'll advise the policymakers on what that policy should look like. Again, these administrators are the ones who are going to be directly implementing these policies and these programs. So they are the experts on these policies and these programs. And so policymakers will solicit their advice on how to design these programs. And then after a policy is made and after a policy is passed by a legislative body, then it is up to the administrators to make sense of that policy and decide how that policy needs to be implemented or executed. Again, Laws tend to be very vague and ambiguous, by their nature, by definition, just in the way in which they can get through a legislative body. So it's then up to the administrators through the rulemaking provisions to write the rules that will govern execution and implementation. The involvement of administrators in policy formation has led to two results. One result of the involvement of administrators in policy formation is increased technicality of public policy. Because you are involving these experts in the formation of policy, these policies tend to become more technical than if you would have not involved administrators in policy formation. So we've had more technicality in our public policies. And also, when you involve administrators in policy formation, it greatly expands the role of the chief executive, because the chief executive ostensibly is in charge of the executive branch and in charge of these executive bureaucratic agencies. So the more role you get to these agencies, the more power and more role you are giving to the chief executive, who is ostensibly in charge of these administrative agencies. So that's kind of your so what question. So what, they're involved in policy formation. Well, you get a lot more technicality in public policy and you expand the role of the chief executive. But today we know that this politics administration dichotomy, first articulated in Woodrow Wilson's The Study of Administration back in 1883, is not a hard demarcation between the political and the administrative side. Because we know administrators are involved in politics. We know administrators are involved in policy formation. Whenever people read the Wilson article, and again, you're going to be reading this Wilson article for next week, their primary takeaway is this politics administration dichotomy, and I think rightly so. But there is a passage in the Wilson article that I would hope that you would look for. And that passage is where Wilson says that politics serve as the touchstone of administration. So even though he's talking about separating out administration so we can study it separately to make it more efficient, make the business of government more efficient, even he recognizes that politics are the touchstone, that we always have to go back to politics in deciding how to administer and how to implement these policies and these programs. That's why in his article, when he talks about adopting the British system of civil service, that's why we took their closed exams and made them into open exams. That's why we took their system of no lateral entry and replaced it with a system of lateral entry to better match our more open political culture. But today, students of public administration realize that there really is a blending of the political as well as the administrative side. But the importance of Wilson is that he was, again, the first one to really point out to us that we need a separate study of administration, which leads us to believe that public administration is something that is worthy of studying as a separate field of study, if not as a completely different academic discipline. So the whole study of public administration comes from this idea from Woodrow Wilson all the way back in 1887. Now, even though we know that policymakers and public administrators are both involved in policy formation, their motivations are different. And that's a really important issue for public administration. The primary motivation of an elected official in policy formation is, again, re-election. And one really great articulation of that re-election motivation comes from an author named David Mayhew, way back in the 1970s. I think it was 1974, I want to say, is when he wrote his book. But David Mayhew, and his book was called Congress, the Electoral Connection. And the primary thesis in his book is that everything that members of Congress do, they do for the purpose of enhancing their re-election prospects. So to enhance their re-election prospects, they engage in three different types of activities. I'll put those in text chat. They engage in advertising, they get their name out there so that people can recognize their name and recall their name, which enhances their re-election prospects. They engage in position taking, where they take very high profile positions on very non-controversial issues. And then finally, they engage in credit claiming, where they claim credit for things, which helps them get reelected. So when they are co-sponsoring a piece of legislation and they are pushing the adoption of a policy in the policy formulation phase, they're oftentimes doing it primarily for the purpose of credit claiming. Because then when they run for re-election, they can say, you know, look at what I did. I co-sponsored this legislation. And so this is something that I did as your representative in Congress. Now, for administrators, they don't have that same re-election type of motivation. They have a different set of motivators. I hope that public administrators are motivated by good policy. And Richard Fenno, a political scientist, talked about good policy as a motivation. We would hope they're motivated to make good policy that will serve the public interest and will benefit citizens. But we also have to be realistic and understand that they are rational, self-interested actors. So sometimes they're motivated by career advancement and they want to move up in the organization. But whether it's career advancement, whether it's making good policy and serving the public interest, their motivations are somewhat separate from the re-election motivation of a member of Congress or a policymaker. So even though they're both involved in policy formation, they're involved in policy formation for different motivations and different purposes. But I would recommend, you know, take a look at the Wilson article and read what he says about the politics administration dichotomy, and just understand that, you know, sometimes when people present the Wilson article in a public administration class, they mischaracterize it as being all about the politics administration dichotomy. But even Wilson recognized that we have to take politics into account whenever we devise our administrative processes and our administrative structures. But the big advantage we get from the Wilson article is the idea of studying public administration. So we kind of create this idea of studying public administration back in the late 1880s. But there are three main generalizations we can make about the study of public administration. These may seem kind of esoteric at this point in time, but they are important. The first generalization is that public administration is timeless, but yet it is also time-bound. By saying it's timeless, it means that there are some maxims and there are some propositions that are as true today as they were 200 years ago. So, you know, treating people with respect in the organization, that's an important practice of personnel human resource management. You treat people with respect and they tend to be more receptive to what you are asking them to do. You know, it doesn't matter if you're treating them with respect in the 1880s or treating them with respect in the 2020s, people tend to respond well to that. But public administration is also time-bound, meaning that public administration theories are very much an artifact of their time in which they were developed. In the 1920s, we had the primary school known as scientific management, and we'll talk about scientific management next week. But in scientific management, the primary goal was to come up with the one best way, the most efficient way to do a job, and then teach all of our employees how to do that job in that efficient way and hold them accountable for doing the job the way we tell them to do it. A very top-down micromanagement approach to how we manage people in doing their jobs. You try doing that today and you're going to run into some trouble, because today the way in which we manage people is much more along the lines of employee empowerment. It's much more of a human resource type of approach, where we try and give them the opportunity to self-govern and self-direct and develop their own skills in order to enhance themselves as human resources. That's something that's true in 2020 that looked a lot different back in 1920 and 1921. So some maxims are timeless, but theories are still an artifact of their time. Public administration is universal, but it's also culture bound and varies according to the situation. So what is universal about public administration is that we're always striving to be effective and we're always trying to be efficient. But we also have to realize that every situation is different, and how we lead and manage in a situation may be different than how we lead and manage in a different situation. So how you lead and manage a large organization will probably be different than how you lead and manage a smaller organization. How you lead and manage a tall hierarchy with a very rigid structure will be different than how you manage a much flatter organization like a commission form of government. So we have to take into account the situation and the culture in that organization And that will then dictate how we engage in administration. So it's universal, but it's also culture bound and varies by situation. It depends. And the third generalization is public administration is complex, but it's only understandable by simplified modeling or combination of models. That we can understand the complexities of public administration through the creation of theories and models. Theories are postulates about how the way in which the world works and relationships between abstract concepts. So it may be, what's the relationship between, happiness, happiness and self-fulfillment. Those are kind of abstract types of concepts, but we can have a theory that the more self-fulfilled you are, the happier you will be. That's kind of a theory. Models are more specific. Models take those abstract concepts and transform them into measurable variables. And so, a model could be the more hours that someone spends participating in this program, the less rates of crime or less instances of crime they will commit. Something that is really measurable. So the number of times they commit a crime is measurable. The number of hours they spend participating in a crime remediation program, that's very measurable. Those are measurable variables. That's kind of a model. The theory is a little bit more abstract. But in order to understand a complex topic like public administration, we have to develop theories and models. Why is the development of theories and models important? Because that's what academic disciplines do. Academic disciplines develop their own unique models to help explain phenomena in their unique area of study. But before we get there and talk about some of the models and theories we develop in public administration, let's kind of dive into this idea of complexity and why the public sector and why public administration is so complex. Because it is so complex, we are going to need multiple theories and multiple models to try and understand it. So why is it so complex? Well, one reason it's so complex is this blending of policy formulation and policy execution. Whenever those lines blur, it does complicate our understanding of who has what role and who does what in the policy process. Coordination. In the public sector, we typically deliver products and we deliver programs oftentimes through cooperation with other organizations. So a local government may cooperate with another local government, with a nonprofit, with a private corporation, with a state agency, with the federal government in order to deliver these products and deliver these programs. Whenever you have coordination that is needed among all these different organizations, that adds a layer of complexity. You have a lot of organizations joining together. You're going to probably have to have some type of articulation agreement, some type of a memorandum of understanding to sort out who is responsible for what. So that complexity comes to us from this need to coordinate activities between organizations. Whenever you have to coordinate activities between organizations, that means that you are forming relationships between a lot of different people and a lot of different entities. And you have to sort out who has the power, who has the resources over what versus who has resources over something else. So all these different relationships, all these different sources of power make it very complex. As we had said before, public administration is kind of flowing in the seeds of time, meaning that they're really an artifact. All of our theories are artifacts of the time in which they were written. You also think about floating in the seas of time in terms of things such as the available resources. You know, if we are trying to restructure an organization and we're in the middle of a major financial downturn, we're probably not going to have the resources at that point in time that we might have 10 or 15 years from now. If we are trying to reorganize an organization after an election where we have a new party in power, that could have an impact upon how we're going to do that reorganization. Organizations are also complex because they have different types of structures. Some organizations are a top-down tall hierarchy. Some organizations are a much flatter, more egalitarian type of organizational structure. Information. We are floating in a sea of information as well, and that information is ubiquitous now. And so whenever we're going to try and be rational and collect information and analyze it for making a decision, we have to be good consumers of that information. We have to know what information is credible, what information is not credible, and that becomes more and more challenging with each passing day in our current environment. Headquarters versus field. So again, different organizations have different organization structures. You think about an organization organization that has all of its offices, one headquarters in the city of Long Beach. Then you have other organizations like the Department of Agriculture that will have regional and field offices spread across the entire nation. Those field offices mean that decision-making is very much disaggregated across all these different offices, as opposed to having one headquarters and one direction coming from one building. So different organizations have different structures, adding to that complexity. And the values that underpin public administration are also very complex. And this is a really important point for our study of public administration. In the private sector, because in the private sector, we are primarily motivated by a profit, making a profit and having that bottom line. One of our major values is going to be obviously efficiency, trying to do more with less to try and maximize our profit share. In the public sector, efficiency is indeed one of our values, but it is a value that competes with many other values as well. So in addition to efficiency, we also are very concerned about effectiveness. The effectiveness, we're concerned about how well our programs are meeting the wants, needs, and desires of our citizens. So are our programs achieving their goals and their objectives? That's a measure of effectiveness, and that goes along with efficiency. In addition to efficiency and effectiveness, we also have a value of social equity. And social equity has become a very important value in public administration. So much so that for accreditation purposes, NASPA now requires an emphasis on social equity in your mission statement as well as in your strategic plan. And enhancing social equity and enhancing social justice must be part of your goals in your strategic plan. So social equity is a very important goal in public administration, very important value in public administration. The protection of individual rights is another thing that we value in the public sector. Again, the whole reason why we spent so much time talking about the Constitution is our qualified good faith immunity as administrators, that we need to know and not violate the constitutional rights of individuals we are dealing with. And that's a higher standard for us in the public sector than oftentimes in the private sector. Political responsiveness is another value of public administration. We need to be responsive to policymakers. We need to fully inform and advise those policymakers and be responsive to them in the oversight process. The more politically responsive we are to policymakers, the more likely we are to answer questions and provide information, the more likely we are to earn their trust and get appropriations in the future. And representative bureaucracy is another very important value in public administration. Representative bureaucracy, we want our organizations to reflect the constituents that those organizations are serving. We want our bureaucracy to represent the public that's being served by those bureaucratic organizations. So public administration becomes very complex because not only do we have all these different values beyond just efficiency and effectiveness, but these values can oftentimes conflict with each other. So if you are putting time and energy into the protection of individual rights, that may erode some efficiency. That may mean that you have to spend more time on individual cases with individual citizens, and you're not going to be able to do the more with less. You're going to be less efficient from a resources perspective because you are protecting those individual rights. Representative bureaucracy, in order to achieve a representative bureaucracy, you're going to have a more complex recruitment process. You're probably going to have to do targeted recruitments. You're going to have to assess your pools in terms of equity and diversity, do the right type of outreach to get the most diverse pools that you can possibly get. It's going to take longer, and justifiably so, going to take longer to hire people and do the staffing function for the purpose of trying to achieve representative bureaucracy. So a multitude of values, and values that oftentimes conflict with each other, again, contribute to the complexity of life in the public sector. Because the reality of the public sector and public administration is so complex, it's too complex to be explained by just an abstract theory. We need to take those abstract theories and distill them into measurable models. But it's still too complex for just one single model. We have to have multiple theories and multiple models for different settings and for different situations. So the complexity of public administration that Woodrow Wilson first identified in 1887, obviously it's a lot more complex today. But the complexity of the public sector and of public administration means that we need to develop unique and multiple theories and models to understand phenomena within the public bureaucracy. The need to develop unique theories and models to understand phenomena really leads us down the path toward being an academic discipline. And this is one of the big questions of this class that we're going to focus on in a couple of different venues. And that is public administration an academic discipline? There is no right or wrong answer to this. The program I came from, my graduate program, was a political science program. So public administration was one of my subfields. I had a subfield in presidency, a subfield in Congress, a subfield in state and urban government, and a subfield in public administration and public policy. So my program viewed it as a subfield of political science. I have colleagues in the program who aren't political scientists. They have a doctoral degree in public administration. Since we have a separate Department of Public Policy Administration here at Long Beach, we do kind of view public administration as being its own discipline, distinct from political science. So that's underscored by the fact that political science is located in a completely separate college than we are in public administration. We're in the College of Health and Human Services. Political science is in the College of Liberal Arts. We are on the even number side of the SPA building. They are on the odd numbered side of the SPA building. So we're completely separate from political science. But in order for you to come to a conclusion about whether you believe public administration is an academic discipline or not, we really need to know what we mean by an academic discipline and what the elements of an academic discipline are. So think about academic disciplines like history or psychology or sociology. What makes those things academic disciplines? What makes one discipline different from another academic discipline? So what are the elements of an academic discipline? Any ideas? And some of you, most of you come from different academic disciplines. Yeah, I know that you would think a majority of students in the MPA program come from a political science background, but they don't. A plurality of students tend to come from political science, but we have students from a lot of other types of backgrounds as well. We have engineers, and we have criminal justice majors, and we have psychologists, and we have history majors, and we have chemists, we have biology majors, geology majors. We have folks coming from all kinds of different academic disciplines. What do you think an academic discipline is? What are the elements of a discipline?
I just gotta say, peer review literature. I come from psychology background, and all throughout my whole BA, that's basically what we studied for peer review literature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a great point. Peer-reviewed articles, peer-reviewed journal articles are really the staple of any academic discipline. And that's true here in public administration as well. So you don't do any research papers in this class because this is kind of the introductory course in the program. But in some of your future courses, you are going to be researching topics in the field of public administration. And when you do that, it's important that the references you use come from those peer-reviewed journal articles. That's a really important point. And that really does contribute to this understanding of a discipline. Because once you use work that comes from a peer-reviewed journal, that means that that manuscript has been reviewed by multiple people who are considered to be experts in the field. who can assess the methods that you use to make sure that the methods that you use were legitimate, that the methods that you use were appropriate, and then led to valid conclusions in that article. There are expectations and norms in academic disciplines for how phenomena will be studied. So different disciplines will use different methodologies and different approaches. In some behavioral sciences, you will use some qualitative approaches. You may use interviewing, you may use focus groups and things such as unobtrusive observation. In some other academic disciplines, it's much more quantitative in nature, where you will take databases and you'll do a meta-analysis of different databases and apply statistical analysis to render your conclusions. So academic disciplines tend to have their own unique methods for measuring the phenomena in their field. And that's a really important part of an academic discipline, in that the methods that they use and the theories and models that they develop tend to be unique and focused. So the way in which you study something in psychology is going to be different than how you study it in maybe criminal justice, or how you study it in biology or in natural science. So the methods are different and the area of focus is different as well. So oftentimes when we're trying to identify if something is an academic discipline, we ask, do they use unique methods and develop unique theories and models to explain phenomena? The question for us in an MPA program as students of public administration is, does public administration demonstrate those elements? Does public administration have unique methods? Does public administration end up developing unique theories and unique models? I'm not looking for an answer for that now tonight, but that is something that I want you to think about, because you're going to have to deal with that issue on the midterm assessment. And then again, in one of our Canvas essay posts, you're going to deal with that issue again. So I want you to think about this over the next couple of weeks. And do you think public administration meets the requirements for being a separate academic discipline? Or do you feel public administration is more of a subfield within an existing discipline, such as something like political science? The big so what question, though, is when you define public administration as an academic discipline, then it means you need separate training in public administration to learn how to study public administration phenomena. If you feel it is just a subfield in another academic discipline, then you don't need separate training in it. You could get a degree in political science and just specialize in public administration. There is one program, I'm not going to mention the name of the program, but there's a program in another state that actually melds the MBA and the MPA programs together, in that they make it one program. And then the culminating activity for graduating in 1 year will be a business-related topic. And then the next year will be a public administration-related topic. Then the next year, a business-related topic. And then next year, a public administration-related topic. That program does not view public administration as being very separate from business administration. But we are all in a Masters of Public Administration program. And as students in the Masters of Public Administration program, we need to grapple with this issue of, is public administration unique enough to be its own academic discipline, and then justify pursuing a separate degree program in public administration? So I'm going to leave that there for you to think about for the next couple of weeks. And again, you'll have a couple of venues in both the midterm as well as in the Canvas essay to flesh out some of those thoughts. Luciano, go ahead.
Hey, Professor, I have a quick question. Is this also so public administration? Can you get a bachelor's in this discipline or in an associate's degree, or is this only a master's degree, for example?
That's a great question. You can get a bachelor's, and there are some universities that offer a bachelor's in public administration. When I was at Florida Gulf Coast, we put together a bachelor's program for political science, as well as a bachelor's degree program in public administration. So those programs do exist at the undergraduate level. It's a much more rare occurrence to see an AA degree, an associate's degree in public administration, but those degrees do exist as well at community colleges. And actually, in the National Academy for Public Administration, otherwise known as NAPA, they have been talking a lot about trying to put funding behind associate degree programs in public administration for people who are in entry-level positions in government, so they have a better understanding of what goes on in public administration. Even though they're not in a management position, at least they can better understand what the goals of public administration, goals of public agencies are. NASPA only accredits MPA programs, MPA and MPP, and graduate public affairs programs at the master's level. But there are also doctoral degrees in public administration, and there are two different types of doctoral degrees. There's the Doctor of Philosophy, the PhD degree in public administration, and then there's also what's called the DPA, which is the Doctorate in Public Administration. The PhD in Public Administration is the academic degree. So if you are very interested in public administration and you want to teach public administration at the university level, you would get a PhD in public administration. If, however, you're a practitioner, a city manager, and you want to go back and get your doctorate in public administration, you would get a DPA, because that's much more the practitioner type of a degree. And there are a variety of PhD programs in political science, as well as DPA programs up and down throughout the state of California. So you can really get public administration training at all levels, all the way from associates, all the way up to the doctoral level. That's a great question. So I think about this, think about public administration as an academic discipline and whether or not you think it meets the qualifications for being an academic discipline. We will next week get into a lot of the theories in the field of public administration. And one thing that you'll notice is some of the theories that we'll talk about next week in public administration are unique, novel theories that were developed by public administration scholars. But a lot of the theories are borrowed from other fields. And so some of our classical theories come from the world of business or the world of sociology. Some of our human relations theories tend to come from the world of psychology. And so we borrow very liberally from a lot of other academic disciplines for our theories in schools of thought that we'll talk about next week. So it's kind of a mixed bag. Some's borrowed and some are going to be new and novel theories that we develop as public administration students. But next week, we'll transition in that discussion of these theoretical perspectives on the study of public administration and give you a little bit more information in terms of answering that question of if you think public administration is a separate academic discipline. That's all I have for this evening. Like I said, next week we'll get into these theoretical perspectives. But do you have any other questions or observations on any of this information? Public administration is an academic discipline, or any of the differences between public and private organizations? If not, then in preparation for next week, you do have some articles from the classics textbook that you're going to be reading. Obviously, the Woodrow Wilson article that we talked about tonight, give that a thorough read because that really creates this foundation for the study of public administration. Then you also have the Max Weber article from the Classical School of Organization Theory that is assigned. I believe I also have the Mary Parker Follett article from more of the human relations type of school of thought that's assigned as well. And then we're going to cover a lot of these different schools of thought. And what I will do is I'll take you through the evolution of the development of theoretical perspectives in public administration, focusing primarily on the study of public organizations, public bureaucracies. So we'll follow it chronologically, because I think following the evolution chronologically makes a lot of sense, because you can kind of see how the literature and how the theories evolved over the past 150 odd years. Okay. Well, thank you very much for being here tonight. We get out a couple of minutes early, so I'm going to try and every week give you a couple minutes back from those first few weeks when I kept you a little bit late. This recording will be up on our Canvas site by tomorrow morning if you want to go back and review any of this information. Again, if you're in the MPA program, make sure to submit your draft advancement candidacy form. If you are not in the MPA program, just give me a little comment in the submission area, just telling me you're not in the program, and I can go ahead and assign those points. Any questions you have at all about the midterm assessment as you start working on, feel free to shoot me an email. Otherwise, I hope everyone has a good remainder of your week, and I'll see you again next Wednesday as we move into week 5 of the course. So thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.